The year was 1945, and in the sprawling rail yards of LaGrange, Illinois, engineers at the Electromotive Division were putting the final touches on a machine that would kill an entire era. It wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. It had no guns, no explosives, no capacity for violence. But what rolled out of that factory on that spring day would prove more devastating to the steam locomotive industry than any bomb ever dropped. The EMD F3 diesel locomotive, painted in sleek streamlined colors that seemed to mock the grimy black monsters it was designed to replace, looked almost toy-like compared to the massive steam engines that had dominated American railroads for over a century. But this unassuming machine, with its 1,500 horsepower diesel engine and revolutionary multiple-unit control system, would accomplish in less than a decade what no economic depression, no world war, and no technological innovation had managed before. It would make the steam locomotive obsolete, unemploy tens of thousands of workers whose skills suddenly meant nothing, and transform the American West from a landscape of coal towers and water stops into a diesel-powered network where trains ran 24 hours without stopping, and railroads finally became profitable again. This is the story of the F3, the diesel horse that buried the age of steam, where technological revolution meant economic survival for corporations and economic devastation for communities, and where progress revealed itself as a force that destroys as ruthlessly as it creates. Before we dive deeper into how one machine changed an entire industry and killed a way of life that had defined America for generations, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We're genuinely curious to know where our audience is located around the world, and your engagement helps us continue bringing these incredible stories of technological transformation. To understand how the F3 became an executioner of history, you need to understand what it was killing and why that death had become inevitable by 1945. The steam locomotive had been the undisputed king of American transportation since the 1830s, a technology so dominant that entire economic systems, military strategies, and patterns of human settlement had organized themselves around its capabilities and limitations. Steam engines were magnificent in their way, massive iron beasts that could haul thousands of tons of freight across mountains and deserts, that announced their presence with whistles that could be heard for miles, that represented human mastery over nature through the conversion of water and coal into motion and power. But steam locomotives were also nightmarishly expensive and inefficient to operate. Mechanical dinosaurs that required small armies of workers to keep them functioning. Every steam locomotive needed a fireman to shovel coal, tons of coal every hour, into fireboxes that burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. They needed engineers who understood the complex interplay of steam pressure, water levels, and valve timing that kept the machines from exploding or stalling. They required constant maintenance by specialized mechanics who could rebuild everything from drive rods to boiler tubes, work that demanded skills passed down through generations of craftsmen who had dedicated their entire lives to understanding these temperamental machines. Even worse, from an operational standpoint, steam locomotives had absurdly limited range. They consumed water at prodigious rates. A heavy freight locomotive could burn through thousands of gallons in a single hour of hard running, which meant that railroads had to maintain elaborate infrastructure of water towers, coal bunkers, and servicing facilities every 50 to 100 miles along every route. In the arid American West, where water was scarce and expensive to transport, this limitation was crippling. Railroads spent fortunes building and maintaining water stops in desert locations where nothing else existed, creating entire communities whose sole purpose was keeping steam locomotives hydrated. The coal infrastructure was equally elaborate and costly. Massive coaling towers had to be constructed at strategic points. Coal had to be mined and transported to these locations, and armies of workers had to load tons of fuel into locomotive tenders multiple times per day. A single cross-country freight train in the steam era might require a dozen crew changes, multiple locomotive swaps, and servicing stops that added hours or even days to journey times, all of which translated directly into costs that made railroads some of the least profitable major industries in America, despite handling the vast majority of freight transportation. The financial pressure on American railroads had been building for decades before the F3 arrived. The Great Depression had devastated the industry, with many major railroads entering bankruptcy as freight volumes collapsed and passenger traffic evaporated when people couldn't afford tickets. World War II had provided temporary relief. The government needed railroads to move troops, weapons, and supplies on a scale never before attempted. But railroad executives knew this boom wouldn't last, and that the post-war world would bring new competitors like trucking companies and airlines that didn't require maintaining thousands of miles of track and infrastructure. Steam locomotives represented a fundamentally 19th-century technology trying to survive in the 20th century. And everyone in the industry understood that something had to change, or railroads would continue their slow death spiral into irrelevance. Diesel-electric technology offered a theoretical solution: internal combustion engines driving electrical generators that powered traction motors on the axles. But early diesel locomotives had been unreliable, underpowered, and viewed with suspicion by engineers and mechanics who understood steam but saw diesels as unproven toys. The Electromotive Division, a subsidiary of General Motors, had been working on diesel locomotive development since the 1930s, producing switcher units and some passenger locomotives. But what the industry really needed was a diesel that could handle heavy freight, operate reliably in extreme conditions, and prove itself superior to steam in every meaningful metric. The F3 was EMD's answer to that challenge, and it was a masterpiece of engineering that solved problems steam locomotives couldn't even acknowledge existed. At its heart was the EMD 567B engine, a 16-cylinder two-stroke diesel that produced 1,500 horsepower while consuming fuel at a fraction of the rate steam engines burned coal. But the real genius wasn't just the engine. It was the complete system EMD had designed around it. The F3 used a diesel-electric transmission that eliminated the mechanical complexity of steam engines entirely. The diesel drove a generator that produced electricity, which powered traction motors connected directly to the driving wheels. This meant no reciprocating parts, no side rods, no complex valve gear that required constant adjustment and maintenance. The system was elegantly simple compared to steam technology, with fewer moving parts and components designed for replacement rather than constant repair. Even more revolutionary was EMD's multiple-unit control system, which allowed several F3 units to be connected together and controlled by a single engineer from the lead locomotive. A railroad could couple 4 F3 units together, creating a 6,000-horsepower locomotive consist that required only one crew and could be configured differently for different loads. Add units for heavy trains, remove them for lighter ones, with flexibility steam locomotives couldn't match. The operational advantages translated directly into cost savings that railroad accountants found almost too good to believe. An F3 unit could run for days without refueling, compared to steam locomotives that needed coal and water every few hours. Diesel fuel could be stored anywhere and pumped quickly, eliminating the need for elaborate coaling towers and water infrastructure. An F3 required dramatically less maintenance. No daily boiler washouts, no constant lubrication of running gear, no teams of mechanics performing preventive maintenance every time the locomotive returned to the yard. The F3 could operate in freezing weather without worrying about water lines bursting or boilers failing, and in desert heat without consuming precious water resources. Most importantly for railroads desperate to cut costs, diesel locomotives needed smaller crews. Steam required a fireman whose entire job was shoveling coal, a brutally physical task that demanded young, strong men. But the F3 eliminated that position entirely. One engineer could operate multiple F3 units producing power equivalent to several steam locomotives, which meant railroads could haul the same freight with a fraction of the labor costs. If you're enjoying this deep dive into how one machine revolutionized an entire industry, we'd really appreciate it if you'd hit that subscribe button right now. We're working hard to reach 1,000 subscribers, and every single subscription helps us continue bringing you these fascinating stories of technological transformation. Your support means everything to our channel. When EMD began delivering F3 units to railroads in 1945, the response from operating departments was cautiously optimistic. But the real test would come in the American West, where harsh conditions had always pushed steam technology to its absolute limits. Railroads like the Santa Fe, Southern Pacific, and Union Pacific operated routes across deserts and mountains where water was expensive, coal had to be transported hundreds of miles, and steam locomotives struggled against grades and heat that pushed them to mechanical failure. These railroads had invested fortunes in infrastructure designed specifically to keep steam locomotives running. Water pipelines crossing deserts, coal mines developed solely to supply locomotives, entire towns built around servicing facilities. And now EMD was promising that diesel could eliminate most of that infrastructure and save millions of dollars annually. The Santa Fe Railway became one of the first major adopters, ordering fleets of F3 units and assigning them to routes where steam had been most problematic. The results were dramatic almost immediately. Trains that had previously required multiple locomotive changes and servicing stops could now run straight through from Chicago to Los Angeles with the same diesel units, cutting journey times by days and eliminating countless hours of expensive delays. Fuel costs dropped precipitously because diesel engines were vastly more thermally efficient than steam plants, where steam locomotives might convert 10 to 15% of fuel energy into useful work. Diesels achieved efficiencies above 30%, meaning railroads could haul more freight while burning less fuel. But the F3's impact went far beyond simple cost savings. It fundamentally restructured how railroads operated and who they employed. The elimination of fireman positions alone represented thousands of jobs that vanished almost overnight. Young men who had expected lifelong careers shoveling coal, suddenly finding themselves unemployed with skills that had become worthless. Boilermakers, pipe fitters, and specialized steam mechanics discovered that diesels didn't need their expertise. The new machines required electricians and diesel mechanics instead. Different skill sets that older workers struggled to learn, and younger workers entering the industry had never bothered to acquire. Entire communities that had existed solely to service steam locomotives found their reason for being erased. Desert towns built around water stops became ghost towns when diesels simply rolled past without stopping, their populations scattering to find work elsewhere. Coal mining towns that had supplied locomotive fuel faced economic collapse when railroads switched to diesel, mines closing and leaving thousands unemployed in communities with no alternative industries. The social cost of dieselization was enormous and largely forgotten in histories that celebrate technological progress. But for the workers and families whose lives were upended, the F3 wasn't progress. It was catastrophe disguised as efficiency. Railroad executives, meanwhile, were celebrating what looked like salvation. Diesels like the F3 transformed railroads from marginally profitable or money-losing enterprises into genuinely lucrative businesses almost overnight. The Southern Pacific, which had struggled financially for years, reported that switching to diesel freight power reduced operating costs by 40% on some routes, while simultaneously increasing reliability and reducing delays that had cost them customer contracts. The Santa Fe discovered that diesel locomotives could maintain schedules with precision impossible in the steam era, where mechanical failures, servicing delays, and crew limitations had made published timetables more aspirational than actual. The Union Pacific, which operated some of the most powerful steam locomotives ever built, massive articulated engines like the legendary Big Boy, found that sets of F3 units could match or exceed the pulling power of these giants while costing a fraction as much to maintain and operate. By the late 1940s, the writing was on the wall for steam power. Railroads stopped ordering new steam locomotives almost entirely, canceled maintenance programs for existing steam fleets, and began scrapping serviceable steam engines in favor of expanding diesel rosters. The F3 and its successors had won the technological war so decisively that steam didn't even fight back. It simply surrendered and died. The cultural impact of the F3 and dieselization extended beyond economics into American identity itself. Steam locomotives had been romantic in a way that purely mechanical objects rarely achieve. They breathed, they seemed alive, they required constant attention and developed personalities that engineers swore were real. Experienced steam engineers could identify individual locomotives by sound and smell, knew their quirks and temperaments, understood how to coax maximum performance from machines that responded to operator skill in ways diesels never would. The death of steam meant the death of this intimate relationship between human and machine, replaced by diesel units that were interchangeable, soulless, and operated more like appliances than living things. Railroad workers mourned this loss even as they acknowledged diesel's superiority, understanding that something ineffable had vanished from their profession. But for the general public and railroad management, diesel locomotives like the F3 represented everything mid-20th century America wanted to believe about itself. Modern, efficient, clean, scientific, and superior to the dirty, outdated technologies of the past. The F3's streamlined design, with its distinctive bulldog nose and colorful paint schemes, became an icon of progress, appearing in advertisements, films, and popular culture as a symbol of American technological prowess. The speed of steam's collapse was astonishing to those who remembered railroading's earlier eras. In 1945, American railroads operated approximately 40,000 steam locomotives and fewer than 1,000 diesels. By 1955, just 10 years later, those numbers had nearly reversed. Steam locomotives had been reduced to perhaps 5,000 units used primarily for switching or on backwater branch lines, while diesel rosters exceeded 30,000 and were still growing. The F3 alone accounted for thousands of units delivered between 1945 and 1949, but its real impact came from proving that diesel freight power worked, which opened the floodgates for successor models like the F7, F9, and eventually the more powerful road switcher designs that would dominate railroading for decades. By 1960, steam locomotives had virtually disappeared from American railroads, except for a handful of units preserved for historical or tourist operations. An entire technological lineage that had dominated transportation for over a century had been exterminated in less than 2 decades, and the F3 had been the weapon that delivered the killing blow. The F3's legacy remains visible today in the hundreds of units preserved in museums and heritage railways across America, painted in the colorful schemes of railroads long since merged or disappeared, operating as tourist attractions that let modern audiences experience a technology that once revolutionized transportation. These preserved F3s run on the same diesel-electric principles that made them successful 70 years ago, though modern railroads have moved on to far more powerful 6,000 horsepower behemoths that make the 1,500 horsepower F3 look quaint. But those modern diesels are direct descendants of the F3, evolutionary developments of technology that proved itself in the harsh crucible of American railroad operation, and demonstrated that internal combustion could definitively surpass steam power. The F3 didn't just replace steam locomotives, it obliterated them so completely that within a generation, young people entering the railroad industry had never seen a steam engine operate, and couldn't understand why anyone would want to. The transition was so thorough that it erased not just the machines, but the entire culture, skill set, and social structure that had grown up around steam technology, creating a discontinuity in railroad history where older workers and younger workers literally spoke different technical languages and understood the job in fundamentally different ways. What makes the F3 story particularly fascinating from a historical perspective is how it reveals the brutal logic of technological change in capitalist economies. Steam locomotives weren't replaced because they stopped working. Many steam engines scrapped in the 1950s had decades of useful life remaining, and could have continued operating if railroads had been willing to maintain them. They were replaced because diesel was more profitable, and in an industry facing financial pressure from trucks, airlines, and changing economic conditions, profitability trumped tradition, nostalgia, and worker welfare every single time. The workers who lost jobs to dieselization weren't compensated or retrained in most cases. They were simply fired or retired early, their decades of accumulated expertise dismissed as obsolete the moment diesel units proved themselves superior. The communities that depended on steam locomotive infrastructure weren't offered economic assistance when their industries collapsed. They were abandoned to find their own survival strategies or die as ghost towns. This is the pattern that repeats throughout industrial history whenever transformative technology arrives. Spectacular benefits for those who control capital and deploy the technology. Devastating losses for those whose labor or communities the technology renders obsolete, and society accepting this as the inevitable price of progress without seriously questioning whether the costs could have been distributed more equitably. If this story has given you new appreciation for how technological change reshapes entire industries and the human cost of progress, please subscribe to our channel right now. We're working toward our goal of 1,000 subscribers, and your support helps us continue producing these in-depth explorations of technological history. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us as we uncover the stories of machines that changed the world and the people whose lives were transformed or destroyed in the process. The F3 stands as a monument to both American engineering achievement and the ruthless efficiency with which capitalism discards anything that doesn't maximize profit, even if what's being discarded is beautiful, functional, and represents generations of human knowledge and skill. The steam locomotives that the F3 replaced weren't failures. They were magnificent machines that had built America, connected coasts, enabled westward expansion, won wars, and represented the pinnacle of 19th-century mechanical engineering. But magnificence doesn't matter when something more efficient arrives, and efficiency is measured solely in dollars saved rather than jobs preserved or traditions honored. The F3 succeeded because it made railroads profitable again, and in an economic system where profitability is the ultimate arbiter of value, that was the only metric that mattered. Today, we can look back at the F3 and the dieselization revolution it led with the perspective of 75 years of hindsight, recognizing both its revolutionary importance to transportation history and the human costs that celebration of technological progress often conveniently forgets. The diesel locomotive saved American railroads from potential extinction and made modern freight transportation economically viable in ways steam never could. But it also destroyed communities, obliterated specialized knowledge that had taken generations to develop, and eliminated thousands of working-class jobs without providing alternatives for the men whose livelihoods vanished. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and understanding the F3's legacy requires holding both truths in mind without dismissing either one. Because history isn't just the story of machines and corporations, it's the story of human beings whose lives are shaped by technological forces they can neither control nor escape, and who must somehow find ways to survive when progress decides they're obsolete. The F3 buried the age of steam, but in doing so, it buried thousands of careers, hundreds of communities, and an entire way of life that will never return except in museums and memories.